the thing that I really see happening, and you can tell me what you think about this, in Neumann's book, consciousness, which is masculine, symbolically masculine for a variety of reasons, is viewed as rising up against the countervailing force of tragedy from an underlying feminine, symbolically feminine unconsciousness, right? And it's something that can always be pulled back into that unconsciousness. That would be, the microcosm of that would be the Freudian Oedipal mother familial dynamic, where the mother is so over protective and all-encompassing that she interferes with the development of the competence, not only of her sons, but also of her daughters, of her children in general. And it seems to me that that's the dynamic that's being played out in our society right now, is that there's this, and it's related in some way that I don't understand, to this insistence that all forms of masculine authority are nothing but tyrannical power. So the symbolic representation is tyrannical father with no appreciation for the benevolent father, and benevolent mother with no appreciation whatsoever for the tyrannical mother, right? And that's that. And because I thought of ideologies as fragmentary mythologies. That's where they get their archetypal and psychological power, right? And so in a balanced representation, you have the terrible mother and the great mother, as Neumann laid out so nicely. And you have the terrible father and the great father. So that's the fact that culture mangles you half to death while it's also promoting you and developing you. You have to see that as balanced. And then you have the heroic and adversarial individual. But in the postmodern world, and this seems to be something that's increasingly seeping out into the culture at large, you have nothing but the tyrannical father, nothing but the destructive force of masculine consciousness, and nothing but the benevolent great mother. And it's an appalling ideology, and it seems to me that it's sucking the vitality, which is exactly what you would expect symbolically. It's sucking the vitality out of our culture. You see that with the increasing demolition of young men, and not only young men, in terms of their academic performance, which, like, they're falling way behind in elementary school, way behind in junior high, and bailing out of the universities like mad. And so, and
well, the public school education has become completely permeated by this kind of anti-male propaganda. I mean, to me, public schools are just a form of imprisonment. You know, right now they're particularly destructive to young men who have a lot of physical energy. Okay, now I identify as transgender. Okay, myself. Okay, but I do not require the entire world to alter itself. Okay, to fit my particular self-image. I do believe in the power of hormones. I believe that men exist and women exist, and they are biologically different. I think there is no cure for the culture's ills right now, except if men start standing up, okay, and demanding that they be respected as men again.
Okay, so I got a question about that. So one of the things, we did a research project a year ago trying to figure out if there was such a thing as political correctness from a psychometric perspective, to find out if the loose aggregation of beliefs actually clumped together statistically. And we actually found two factors, which I won't go into, but then we looked at things that predicted adherence to that politically correct creed. And there were a couple that were surprising. One was being female was a predictor. The personality attributes associated with femininity, so that would be agreeableness and higher levels of negative emotion, were also both independent predictors, but so were symptoms of personality disorder, which I thought was really important, because part of what I see happening is that, like, I think that women whose relationship with men has been seriously pathologized cannot distinguish between male authority and competence and male tyrannical power. Like, they fail to differentiate because all they see is the oppressive male. And they may have had experiences that their experiences with men might have been rough enough so that differentiation never occurred, because it has to occur. And you have to have a lot of experience with men, and good men too, before that will occur. But it seems to me that we're also increasingly dominated by a view of masculinity that's mostly characteristic of women who have terrible personality disorders and who are unable to have healthy relationships with men. Now, but here's the problem. You know, this is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves, but here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical. right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up in what? It's not even disbelief. It's that there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. You know, if you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, you know, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. So I don't know, like, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal. I really do believe that.
I too believe that this is symptomatic of the decline of Western culture, and it will just go down flat. I don't think people realize that, you know, masculinity still exists, okay, in the world as a code among jihadists, okay, and when you have passionate masculinity, okay, circling the borders like the Huns and the Vandals during the Roman Empire, that's what I see. I see this culture rotting from within, okay, and disemboweling itself, literally. Now, I have an overview of why we're having these problems, right? And it comes from the fact that I'm the product of an immigrant family. All four of my grandparents and my mother were born in Italy. So I remember from my earliest years in this factory town in upstate New York, where my relatives came to work in the shoe factory. I can remember still, okay, the life of the agrarian era, okay, which was for most of human history, okay, the agrarian era, where there was the world of men and the world of women, and the sexes had very little to do with each other. Each had power and status in its own realm, right? And they laughed at each other in essence, okay? Yeah. The women had enormous power. In fact, the old women ruled, not the young, beautiful women like today, okay? But the older you were, the more you had control over everyone, including the mating and marriage. There were no doctors, so you had the old women were like midwives and knew all the ins and outs of this inherited knowledge about pregnancy and all these other things, right? I can remember this and the joy that women had with each other all day long, okay? Cooking with each other, companions to each other, talking, conversing. My mother remembered as a small child in Italy, when it was time to do the laundry, they would take the laundry up the hill to the fountain, Il Sorgo, okay, and do it by hand. They would sing, they would picnic, and so on, all right? And we get a glimpse of that in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is thrown up naked on the shores of Phaeacia, all right? And he hears the sound of women, young women laughing and singing, and it's Nausicaa, the princess, bringing the women to do the laundry. Okay, it's exactly the same thing, right? So there was each gender had its own hierarchy, its own values, its own way of talking, and the sexes rarely intersected. Like I can remember in childhood, on a holiday, typical, it could be a Christmas, it could be a Thanksgiving, whatever, the women would be cooking all day long, everyone would sit down to eat, okay, and then after that, okay, the women would retire en masse to the kitchen, and the men would go, I would look through the window and see all the men. The men would be all outside, usually usually gather around the car, okay, at a time when cars didn't work as well as they do today, with the hood up, okay, and the men would be standing with their hands on their hips like that, everyone's staring at the engine, okay, and I went, yeah, that's how I learned, okay, men were refreshing themselves by studying something technical and mechanical after being with the women, okay, you know, during the dinner, okay, so all of these problems of today are the direct consequence of women's emancipation and freedom from housework, thanks to capitalism, okay, which made it possible for women to have jobs outside the home for the very first time in the 19th century, no longer to be dependent on husband or father or brother, right? And so this great thing that's happened to us, that allowing us to be totally self-supporting, independent agents, has produced all this animosity between men and women, because the women feel unhappy. Women today, wherever I go, whether it's Italy or Brazil or England or America, okay, or Toronto, okay, the upper middle class professional women are unhappy, miserable. They don't know why they're unhappy. They want to blame it on men.
La revolución necesita de tu ayuda. Deposita, suscríbete, comparte los videos, apórtanos en el Patreon para que podamos seguir luchando por la libertad.